Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining in on our ELA virtual instruction for the week of April 20th to the 24th. This counts as week 5 in our virtual instruction. This is the standard that we're going to be focusing on this week. This just focuses on us being able to delineate and evaluate the argument and specific claims in a text, assessing whether the reasoning is valid and the evidence is relevant and sufficient. This is standard RI 3.8. So let's just kind of clarify some of these terms. These terms that we're looking at are valid, relevant, sufficient. This term delineate, evaluate, or sometimes we're not sure what those terms mean, especially when we look at it in sense of the standard. So what is valid evidence? So valid evidence is just evidence that is factual, well-known, or common knowledge, evidence that has an identified source or provider of information, evidence that is trustworthy and reliable, meaning just dependable. Let me backtrack here a little bit. What does delineate mean? It just means to describe or outline. To evaluate means to make a judgment. Over here we have what is relevant evidence. So evidence that supports the claim, evidence that's related to the topic or issue. What is sufficient evidence? Evidence that's enough in quantity to make the author's point clearly understood. So sufficient meaning like, is there enough evidence to prove the point? And evidence that comes from a variety of sources, not just from one perspective. Okay, so sufficient meaning is there enough of it, and does it come from more than one perspective? So let's really build our understanding of the criteria. Okay, so I want to give you a scenario. This isn't on your actual text here. It's just going to be me talking for the moment. But I want you to think about this scenario, and I'm going to give you a few examples that I think will make more sense of these factors, these three factors that we're looking at, which are validity, relevance, and sufficiency. So let's say that I'm reading an article that focuses on the negative impact of social distancing during this global pandemic, specifically on adolescents' mental health. So something that would be valid evidence to include in the article would be things like facts or conducted research about, increase in depression or due to isolation, research about anxiety in terms of violating social distancing protocols, maybe even personal anecdotes, which would just be personal experiences, and also names and details about the sources of information or researchers. So that would be considered valid evidence. Now, what would relevant evidence look like? Relevant evidence would be something like an intro to various mental illnesses like anxiety and depression, overview of social distancing practices, and anything like that would be included. That would be relevant or important to, addressing that topic of the article. And sufficient evidence, something that we could put into an article like that, would be testimonies from a variety of people, not just one certain age group. We would have different socioeconomic groups, different ethnic backgrounds, different genders, and so on. So it needs various forms of data or research to address different types of mental illness. So I hope that made a little bit more sense in terms of what those three terms mean, valid, relevant, and sufficient. But basically, in short, the evidence that we're reading or the support that the authors provide for their claims, they have to be trustworthy, which just means that they're valid. They have to be connected to the topic at hand, which just means that they are relevant, and they have to fully satisfy your understanding of that topic, which just means that it's sufficient. So why is it important that authors support their arguments or claims with evidence that has those three components? So it's valid, reliable, and sufficient. When we are reading, we are often absorbing content to become informed, entertained, persuaded. When we interact with content that lacks those three components, we are limiting the knowledge that we can access. Consequently, we can't make informed decisions about the world around us or draw accurate conclusions. This limitation can directly impact how we operate, as our actions are largely based on what we believe and what we understand. Okay, so now that all that's out of the way, that's just a little bit of background information on the standard itself so that you understand that what we are going to be looking at for the assignment this week. So in terms of what you are responsible for this week, here we go. You have your weekly attendance question. You have your achieved article. You have a pre-reading activity, which is assignment 5A. You have assignment 5B, parts 1 and 2, which has to do with the story that we're going to be reading. It's an argumentative essay, very, very short, only a couple of pages. It's called Is Survival Selfish by Lane Wallace. And then lastly, you have your post-reading activity, which is assignment 5C. That's usually the essential question. And then, of course, your independent reading and log. So if you have not done so already, please go ahead and answer the attendance question on Teams. It's located under the attendance channel, as you hopefully know by now. So the question of the week is, did you pick your elective classes for next year? And if so, what did you choose to take? If you did not, please reach out to me. Your response must be in the form of a complete sentence to count. Post your answer by April 24th to be marked present for the week. You, of course, have your Achieve article. So the article this week is called The Brain Question. Read that article, answer the questions. Remember that you need to score a 75% or higher for this to count. If you are struggling to obtain that 75% or higher, you can also do the stretch article. And I can count that as well. Okay, so let's get ready to knock out our pre-reading activity, which is assignment 5A. Of course, as you know, this is just to build some background knowledge in continuing our journey towards the fight for survival. That's the theme that we've been looking at. We'll explore the societal perceptions of those who risk their lives to save others and those who choose to save their own lives while leaving others behind. Ultimately, societal perception is about the way that a large group of people see or view an idea, a person, a certain behavior or action, which leads them to a certain type of treatment, which can be negative or positive, depending on the subject at hand. So given the pandemic that we're enduring at the moment, I thought it would be worthwhile to show you how one group of people, particularly those who are working in healthcare, risk their lives every single day to ensure the wellness of their patients. So let's take a look at our video on shift in a New York hospital overwhelmed by coronavirus patients. Pause the video here so you can watch the YouTube video. You can just copy this link into your browser. It's about a 5-minute long video, but do watch it because you have some questions to answer. When you are finished, I will meet you on your assignment on the portion that says assignment 5A. So once you have finished watching that YouTube video, you just have a couple of questions here. After you've viewed that YouTube video that you just watched, respond to the following prompts in the space provided. Question number 1, based on the video, what do you believe inspires the medical staff to remain committed to saving the lives of others and risking their own well-being in the midst of the tragedy sweeping New York hospitals? Okay, so this is kind of your opinion, but take some information from that video, but tell me what you think inspires them to stay, working and continuing to help other people. Second question here, identify one quote from the video that resonates, meaning just affects you emotionally, produces a strong emotional response. Okay, so just take about 5-10 minutes to work on that, and then I will meet you back on your assignment. Okay, so let's look at the graphic organizer that we are going to be using here. But before we do that, I want to just kind of set this purpose for reading. Remember, we always want to make sure we know why we're reading. So let's clarify the larger question that we need to understand while we're reading our text. Okay, remember that the text is called Is Survival Selfish? So the essential question is what we need to be able to answer at the end of the lesson, as always. Which claim regarding society's treatment of those who risk their lives to save others and those who choose to save themselves does Lane Wallace most effectively support in her argumentative text? Is survival selfish? So in the text, Lane Wallace states, we still tend to laud those who risk or sacrifice themselves to save others in moments of danger or crisis and look less kindly on those who focus on saving themselves instead. So when she says we, that just means our society as a whole. The term laud means to praise or celebrate. So we tend to praise or celebrate those who risk to sacrifice themselves. Look less kindly just means that it's disapproved of or viewed unfavorably. So within this statement, the author makes two claims. Number one, that society praises sacrifice, in other words, risking your life to save others, and also that society disapproves of self-preservation. Okay, so saving yourself and not other people. So the author already has the claim. It already is stated here. Now our purpose for this standard is to determine which claim is most effectively supported through evidence that is valid, relevant, and sufficient. Okay, so once again, the author makes two claims here. We have to figure out which one is the most valid, the most relevant, has the most sufficient evidence. Okay, so we're going to look at the graphic organizer that we're going to be using for this assignment. This portion of it is assignment 5B. It's parts 1 and 2. So I'm just going to flip over to the assignment here, scroll down. Here's where my assignment 5B is, and just follow along as I read the directions. So while reading Is Survival Selfish? Track the evidence/support, which is going to be part 1, that the author, Lane Wallace, provides to support her claim. We still tend to laud those who risk or sacrifice themselves to save others in moments of danger or crisis, and look less kindly on those who focus on saving themselves instead. Be sure to include details from the text, page numbers, and line numbers in your tracker for citations. And then part 2, which is going to be down here, use the following score guide to evaluate both claims for validity, relevance, and sufficiency. Assign a score for each category for both claims based on the score guide and calculate your total score at the bottom. So we're not going to worry about that one right now. Let's worry about the graphic organizer and getting through the text. Okay, so I'm going to just, as always, make this a little bit smaller here. I'll minimize this PowerPoint, and I need to pull up my text. So the text here is on page 317. Just as a reminder, when you are going into the MyHRW, you're going to go to One View, go to Blended Learning. You're going to click on MyHRW, click on your student ebook, and it should pull up like this. To find that page, I would just go up here and type in 317 and press enter, and it'll bring me to this page. To get the page to look like this, I just click on page view, and I would select on scrolling. Okay, so hopefully this will work. Sometimes it struggles a little bit when I'm trying to pull this stuff up. So let's see here. There we go. Okay. So I'm just going to keep that on this side and have my text on each side. So we're just going to read through this, and I'm going to just show you here that each box here, remember the two claims that we talked about here. Let's just pull this back up. The two claims, number 1, society praises sacrifice, society disapproves of self-preservation in terms of survival. Okay, so we have society praises sacrifice. We want to look for specific evidence that talks about that here. And then we also, on this side, we want to talk about, or find specific evidence that talks about how society disapproves of self-preservation, which is just saving yourself and not other people. Okay, so I'm just going to start reading. And as I'm reading, I'm going to be looking for these two pieces of evidence here. Okay. All right, once again, we're on page 317. Is survival selfish? When the ocean liner Titanic sank in April of 1912, one of the few men to survive the tragedy was J. Bruce Ismay, the chairman and managing director of the company that owned the ship. After the disaster, however, Ismay was savaged by the media and the general public for climbing into a lifeboat and saving himself when there were other women and children still on board. Ismay said he'd already helped many women and children into lifeboats and had only climbed in one himself when there were no other women or children in the area and the boat was ready to release. But it didn't matter. His reputation was ruined. He was labeled an uncivilized coward, and a year after the disaster, he resigned his position at the White Star. So that's definitely one thing that I can add to this side, because clearly society disapproved of him self-preserving. Even though he said that he helped other women and children, he was ridiculed and his reputation was ruined because he saved himself. Okay, so I'm going to just type that in here. I'm going to say, when the ocean liner, remember I tried to copy and paste this before, but it didn't work. I don't think it'll work. Yeah, it doesn't work when you copy. So we're just going to type it out. Just take your time. The ocean liner Titanic sank, one of the few men to survive the tragedy was J. Bruce Ismay. ... After the disaster, Ismay was savaged, what does it say, by the media and the general public. For climbing into a, good grief, public for climbing into a lifeboat when other women and children were still on board. I also kind of want to include this part here. His reputation was ruined. That seems pretty important. His reputation was ruined. He was labeled uncivilized, coward, ... Okay, so that's from page 317, lines, what is that? Lines 1 through 12. 1 through 11, sorry. Okay, so I'm going to put that here. So that's lines 1 through 11. So that's definitely something that talks about how society disapproves of that. That's an example that the author is using here. Okay, let's keep going. The, quote, women and children first protocol of the Titanic may not be as strong a social structure as it was a century ago, but we still tend to laud those who risk or sacrifice themselves to save others in moments of danger or crisis, and look less kindly on those who focus on saving themselves instead. So remember that this is the author's main claim right here. Okay, we're already given that main claim. But is survival really selfish and uncivilized, or is it smart? And is going in to rescue others always heroic? Or is it sometimes just stupid? It's a complex question because there are so many different factors involved, and every survival situation is different. Self-preservation is supposedly an instinct. So one would think that in life and death situations, we'd all be very focused on whatever was necessary to survive. But that's not always true. In July 2007, I was having a drink with a friend in Grand Central Station when an underground steam pipe exploded just outside. From where we sat, we heard a dull boom, and then suddenly people were running, streaming out of the tunnels and out the doors. My friend and I walked quickly and calmly outside, but to get any further, we had to push our way through a crowd of people who were staring, transfixed at the column of smoke rising from the front of the station. Some people were crying, others were screaming, others were on their cell phones. But for the crowd, for the most part, was not doing the one thing that would increase everyone's chances of survival. If in fact a terrorist bomb with God knows what inside of it had just gone off, namely moving away from the area. We may have an instinct for survival, but it clearly doesn't always kick in the way it should. A guy who provides survival training for pilots told me once that the #1 determining factor for survival is simply whether people hold it together in crisis or fall apart. And, he said, it's impossible to predict ahead of time who's going to hold it together and who's going to fall apart. So what is the responsibility of those who hold it together? I remember reading the account of one woman who was in an airliner that crashed on landing. People were frozen or screaming, but nobody was moving toward the emergency exits, even as smoke began to fill the cabin. After realizing that the people around her were too paralyzed to react, she took direct action, crawling over several rows of people to get to the exit. She got out of the plane and survived. Very few others in the plane very few others in the plane, which was soon consumed by smoke and fire, did. And afterward, I remember she said she battled a lot of guilt for saving herself instead of trying to save the others. Okay, so this person here, this isn't necessarily society disproving, but since this woman felt guilt about saving herself, the author says, I remember she said she battled a lot of guilt for saving herself instead of trying to save the others. That's obviously indicative that society disapproves of that self-preservation, because even though she still lived and she may not have been able to save those other people, that she is feeling that societal guilt. So I'm going to add that over on this side. So I'm going to say, let's say the woman on airliner crash. I remember she said that she battled a lot of guilt for saving herself instead of trying to save the others. Okay, and that is from page 318, lines 50, 51, 52, 52 to 54. Okay, so that's something talking about how society is, kind of made this woman feel as if she was guilty for saving herself and not other people. Okay, let's continue. Could she really have saved the others? Probably not, and certainly not from the back of the plane. If she'd tried, she probably would have perished with them. So why do survivors berate themselves for not adding to the loss by attempting the impossible? Berate means to criticize or scold themselves. Perhaps it's because we get very mixed messages about survival ethics. On one hand, we're told to put our own oxygen mask on first and not to jump in the water with a drowning victim. But then the people who ignore those edicts and survive to tell the tale are lauded as heroes, and people who do the, quote, smart thing are sometimes criticized quite heavily after the fact. In a famous mountain climbing accident chronicled in the book and documentary Touching the Void, climber Simon Yates was, let's see if this will go down, attempting to rope his already injured friend Joe Simpson down a mountain in bad weather when the belay went awry. Simpson ended up hanging off a cliff, unable to climb up, and Yates, unable to lift him up and losing his own grip on the mountain, ended up cutting the rope to Simpson to save himself. Miraculously, Simpson survived the 100-foot fall and eventually made his way down the mountain. But Yates was criticized for some of his survival decision, even though the alternative would have almost certainly led to both of their deaths. So there's another example that we can use. I can definitely put this part here in the side that talks about disproving, because he was criticized, right? So that's going to be something that I can add here. So I'm going to put mountain climber Yates, and I'm going to add that quote. But Yates was criticized by some for his survival decision, even though the alternative would have most certainly led to both of their deaths. Okay, that comes from page, we're on page 319. Those are lines, let's see, 74, 75, 76. Line 74 to line 76. So once again, this is just a criticism of that. This mountain climber gets criticized because he cut the rope off and saved himself, because they probably both would have died if he didn't do that. Okay, so let's continue here. In Yates' case, he had time to think hard about the odds and the possibilities he was facing, and to realize that he couldn't save anyone but himself. But what about people who have to make the more instantaneous decisions? If in fact survivors are driven by instinct, not civilization, How do you explain all those who otherwise, I'm sorry, I messed up. If, in fact, survivors are driven by instinct, not civilization, how do you explain all those who choose otherwise? Who would dive into icy waters or onto subway tracks or disobey orders to make repeat trips onto a minefield to bring wounded to safety? Are they more civilized than the rest of us? More brave? More noble? It sounds nice, but oddly enough, most of the people who perform such impulsive rescues say they didn't really think before acting, which means they weren't choosing civilization over instinct. If survival is an instinct, it seems to me that there must be something equally distinctive that drives us, sometimes to run into danger instead of away from it. Perhaps it comes down to the ancient fight or flight impulse. Animals confronted with danger will choose to attack it or run from it, and it's hard to say which one they'll choose or when. Or maybe humans are such social herd animals dependent on the herd for survival that we feel a pull toward others even as we feel a contrary pull toward our own preservation. And the two impulses battle it out within us, leading to mixed messages we send each other on which impulse to follow. Some people hold it together in crisis and some people fall apart. Some people might run away from danger one day and toward it the next. We pick up 1,000 cues in an instant of crisis and respond in ways that even surprise ourselves sometimes. But while we laud those who sacrifice themselves in an attempt to save one another, there is a fine line between brave and foolish. There can also be a fine line between smart and selfish. And as a friend who served in the military for 27 years says, the truth is, sometimes there's no line at all between the two. Okay, so that's the end of that. And I know that I actually can't find any more evidence on this side that talks about how society disapproves. Okay, so I'm going to just add here, no other support provided or offered. No other support provided in text. Ooh. Okay, I'm going to add that down here. I don't know why this 3 showed up. Okay. Once again, no other support provided in text. Now, I didn't go over any of these parts here, but I'm going to just kind of quickly run back. So there was not very many instances where the author talks about how society praised that self-sacrifices, but one of those ways was back on line 61 to 64, so jump back there, which is up here. Okay, 61 to 64. So on one hand, we're told to put down our own oxygen mask on first and not to jump in the water with a drowning victim. But then the people who ignore those edicts and survive to tell the tale are lauded as heroes, and people who do the smart thing are sometimes criticized quite heavily after the fact. So this is something that is evidence that praises that sacrifice, that risking your own life to save others. So the author claims that they are, lauded or are described as heroes. So I'm going to add that over here. I'm going to say, on the one hand, we're told to put our own oxygen masks on first and not to jump in the water with a drowning victim. But then the people who ignore those edicts and survive to tell the tale are lauded as heroes. And that comes from pages 380. Line 61 to 64. Okay. Now, I'm going to give you a little hint here. There's actually only one more piece of evidence for this side. Now, for those of you that are actually watching and not just fast forwarding and pausing on this, I'm going to verbally tell you what this one is here. Okay, so the next part here is going to be lines 104 to 105. So I'm going to jump down here. This is the next portion of the text, as you can probably already tell by my markers here. So lines 104 to 105. But while we laud those who sacrifice themselves in an attempt to save another, there is a fine line between brave and foolish. There can also be a fine line between smart and selfish. Okay, so basically, we praise those who sacrifice themselves to say who save one another. So I'm going to put that that line where the number 2 box is. And once again, that's on page 320, lines 104 to 105. And below that, obviously, since I told you that that's the last one, clearly 3, 4, and 5 are going to be no other support provided in the text. So go ahead and pause the video here and copy that in. Okay, so I'm going to minimize this here. I'm going to bring up the PowerPoint once again. So we completed this first part here. After reading the text, review the evidence that, while reading is survival selfish, track the evidence, support that the author provides to support her claim. Okay, so now we need to move on to part 2, which basically is just us, reviewing that evidence that we've just looked at, and we're going to assign a score for validity, relevance, and sufficiency for each claim. So I'm going to go down here. Okay. So in terms of, let me just read the directions real quick. So assignment 5B, get rid of this. I can't. Okay, there it goes. Use the following score guide to evaluate both claims for validity, relevance, and sufficiency. So valid means like, is it, does it make sense? Is it relevant? Is it sufficient? Assign a score for each category for both claims based on the score guide and calculate your total score at the bottom. Score guides. Assign a score of 0 if the criteria for evidence is not shown in the text at all. Assign a score of 1 if the criteria for evidence is partially or inconsistently shown in the text. Assign a score of 2 if the criteria for evidence is fully shown in the text. So criteria for evaluating claims is survival selfish, which is the name of our text. Is there valid evidence for this claim? So is there valid evidence for this claim society praises sacrifice and risking your life to save others? Is there valid evidence? Evidence that is factual, well-known, or common knowledge, evidence that has an identified source, provider of information, evidence that has a trustworthy and reliable or dependable source. So I would just look at this and I would say, okay, is it valid? So just as a reminder, let's go back here and look at what that means, what it means to have valid, relevant, and sufficient evidence. Okay. So valid evidence is just common knowledge. It's well known, it's factual. It also has an identified source and it's trustworthy. Is it relevant? Does it support the claim? Is it related to that topic or issue? Lastly, is it sufficient? Is there enough of it? Does it make the point clearly understood? And does it come from different sources, not just from one perspective? Okay, so I want you guys to take a moment to just score this on your own. Okay, this is your own thought process based on what we just did here. Okay, this is based on what we just finished there. I want you to just take a minute to score it. So for this one here, I know that society praises sacrifice, risking your life to save others. Just based on this information that I have here, remember we have this one filled out. I only have 2 things for praising sacrifice, risking your life to save others. Okay. So I don't know, what do you think the validity of that would be? So just put in some numbers here. You just type in your numbers, one like here, 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 and here. You don't have to worry about this. I'm going to actually delete that. Don't worry about that. Okay. This is just the second part of that standard, which is just looking at, whether or not that evidence is reasonable, if it makes sense. Okay. So go ahead and take a couple of minutes with that. Don't think too heavily, okay? And I will just pause the video. Okay. Lastly, we have our post-reading activity, which is assignment 5C. Based on reading is survival selfish, which claim regarding society's treatment of those who risk their lives to save others and those who choose to save themselves does Lane Wallace most effectively support? You are encouraged to utilize your graphic organizer to assist in crafting your response. So as always, that is going to go right here. But if you are listening this far, I'm going to ask that you are not required to do this week. All I want you to do is type in next to post-reading activity. I want you to just type in, Mrs. Burns, I watch your videos, and then you don't have to do it, and I will accept that answer. Okay, so I'm going to go back here. Lastly, your task 6, assignment 5D. On days that you aren't completing an Achieve article, you are to complete the independent reading. So make sure that you are completing that reading. You should be logging it on the end of your paper. I'll add that down at the bottom there. Remember, that's assignment 5D. So hopefully you enjoyed reading that text, and I hope that this assignment, if you are watching the videos, you know that this assignment was fairly easy because the only thing that you really did was that scoring and the beginning there. So I appreciate you engaging in virtual classroom and actually watching the videos. Hopefully it is becoming rewarding to watch the videos. I really appreciate you. Don't forget to complete this weekly reading log. Stay tuned for our next lesson. I will get it out to you next Monday as well. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to join the live meetings. I do ask that at least once you join a live meeting this week, even if it's just to kind of check in and say hi. It doesn't have to be anything in particular. I would appreciate it. If you have any questions, go ahead and send me a message on Remind. You can also join those live meetings. I hope you guys have a wonderful day. Don't forget to smile today.